In the heart of the galaxy, a small alien race faced its last days. The flames from their cities stretched high into the sky, lighting up the night with an orange glow. The once proud structures were now piles of rubble, crumbling under the weight of destruction. Their homes, their families, their way of life were all being torn apart by an unstoppable force. Their people, caught between the unrelenting invaders and the wreckage of their cities, were slowly fading away. They had fought as hard as they could, but it was no use. The invaders were stronger, faster, and had more weapons than the alien race could ever dream of. The survivors, now just a small handful, huddled together in the ruins, watching as their world fell to pieces. Their leaders, broken by the weight of failure and the endless suffering of their people, knew they had no choice left. They had tried to defend their planet, to fight back against the invaders, but all they had gained were more casualties. Now, only one option remained. They had to beg. They had to send a message, a cry for help, hoping that someone, anyone, might hear it. With their technology fading, they managed to send out a faint signal, hoping the message would reach someone in the endless void of space. The message was simple, filled with desperation. We are dying. Our cities are burning. Our people are falling. Please, help us. We ask for mercy. We ask for peace. We are not soldiers. We do not wish to fight. Please, hear our plea. They spoke of their destruction, of the end of their civilization, and of their desperation for aid. Their voice shook with fear, but it was all they could offer. The signal, weak and fading, traveled through the cold emptiness of space. It reached far beyond the confines of their world, beyond their galaxy, into the void where only silence existed. Their planet was alone in the darkness, a tiny speck of life, desperate for a savior. As their message spread across the stars, the survivors waited, their hopes clinging to the hope that someone might answer. The cold silence of space seemed endless. Days, weeks, then months passed, and there was still no response. The survivors, growing weaker with each passing day, clung to their fragile hope. Would anyone hear their call? Would anyone come? Their planet was dying, their people fading away, but still, they waited. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the sky above them filled with the smoke of destruction. They prayed to the stars, hoping that somewhere, someone, would be listening. In the distance, light years away, a different story was unfolding. The message had traveled through the endless dark of space, crossing stars, systems, and galaxies, until it reached a destination far beyond the alien race's imagination. The signal was picked up by an ancient, powerful species. The Deathworlders. Humanity. The most feared species in the galaxy, known not for their mercy, but for their strength and their unrelenting power. The Deathworlders, unlike any other species in the galaxy, didn't offer small aid or small solutions. They didn't care for weaklings or peacekeepers. They only understood power. And when the message from the alien race reached them, they didn't hesitate. The signal of desperation, so full of fear and weakness, stirred something deep inside them, but it wasn't compassion. It was a different kind of response. One that the alien race could never have imagined. The Deathworlders did not offer mercy. They did not send peacekeepers. They responded with fleets, with weapons, with an answer that was not a gentle hand but an iron fist. They didn't hear the plea for help and think of healing. They heard it and saw an opportunity to show their might. The alien race had hoped for salvation, for a way to escape the pain, but what came instead was the overwhelming force of the Deathworlders. Meanwhile, the survivors continued to wait, their hopes slowly turning to despair. They had sent the message, they had begged for help, and yet nothing had changed. The invaders continued their relentless attack. The survivors had no food, no shelter, and no way to defend themselves. It seemed that their last hope had failed, that they were doomed to extinction, forgotten in the vastness of space. But then, something changed. It wasn't a voice that came back to them, but a force. The first sign of it was a shadow crossing the sky. The survivors, weak and starving, looked up at the sudden darkness above them. They thought it was another wave of destruction, another attack from the invaders. But it wasn't. It was something else. Something far worse. The Deathworlders had arrived. The sky grew darker as the first ship of the fleet descended. It was enormous, far larger than anything the aliens had ever seen. It blocked out the stars, casting an enormous shadow over the planet. It was followed by more ships, endless lines of warships, bristling with weapons. The ground shook as the massive fleet approached, their engines humming with power, their weapons charged and ready. The survivors watched, paralyzed with fear. What they had called for, what they had hoped for, had arrived, but it wasn't the salvation they had imagined. It was not healing. It was not mercy. It was domination. The ships landed with the sound of thunder, shaking the very earth beneath them. The survivors cowered in their shelters, eyes wide with terror, as soldiers in dark, armored suits began to disembark from the ships. Their presence was terrifying, their movements cold and methodical. They weren't here to offer help. They were here to enforce their will, to show the alien race the true meaning of power. The survivors had begged for mercy, for aid, for peace, but instead, they had summoned the Deathworlders. And what came was not kindness, but overwhelming force, the kind of power that crushed everything in its path. The fleet, the soldiers, the weapons, they were all part of a message the alien race couldn't comprehend. When you call out to the Deathworlders, you don't ask for help. You ask for something far darker, something that only the strongest species in the galaxy could offer. The survivors realized, too late, that they had made a terrible mistake. They had sent their message of desperation, hoping for a savior, and instead, they had awakened something they could never control. The Deathworlders had come, not to save, but to conquer. They had come with firepower, with fleets, and with a strength so vast that the alien race was left powerless in their wake. In the distance, the fleet loomed overhead, ready to carry out their mission. The alien survivors, now helpless in the face of overwhelming force, could only watch as their world was swallowed by the shadow of the Deathworlder fleet. They had asked for help, but the answer they received was a lesson they would never forget. The Deathworlders did not do small aid. They sent fleets. The first sign of humanity's arrival was a darkening of the sky. The alien survivors, barely holding on to their fragile hope, looked up in confusion and fear as something immense blotted out the stars. The light that once bathed their cities in a dim, familiar glow was swallowed by the shadows of massive ships descending from above. They had expected healers, perhaps a kind army that would help them rebuild. But this was something else entirely. The ships were like nothing they had ever seen, dark and imposing, with sharp, angular shapes and glowing red engines. They moved silently, cutting through the atmosphere with terrifying speed. The aliens had no idea what was happening, no idea that the message they had sent, so full of desperation and pleading, had reached a force far beyond anything they could have imagined. The sky above them was filled with fire as the ship's engines ignited, their presence overwhelming. The survivors, scattered and broken, watched in stunned silence. What had they summoned? The alien leaders who had once made decisions in grand chambers filled with light and hope now found themselves on their knees, unsure if they had made a terrible mistake. The fleet was immense, too large, too strong. There was no escaping the realization. They had asked for help, but what had come was far worse. Their planet was not just a place that needed aid. It was a place that would be claimed, a place that would be taken. The ships landed in perfect, organized formations. No one could have anticipated such precision, such strength. The ground trembled with the weight of their arrival, and the air itself felt heavier. The Deathworlders had arrived, not to offer the help they had asked for, but to establish their dominance. The soldiers who emerged from the ships were nothing like the alien survivors had expected. There were no signs of mercy in their faces, no gestures of kindness. Instead, they were cold, calculating, and imposing. Each soldier was dressed in black armor that glinted under the dim light, their faces hidden behind dark helmets with glowing red eyes. The soldiers carried weapons that hummed with deadly power. This wasn't an army of healers. This was an army of war. The alien survivors felt the walls of their homes closing in on them. Where once there was hope, now there was fear. They had not called for warriors. They had called for peacekeepers. They had hoped for salvation. Instead, The Deathworlders had come with firepower, with destruction, with a chilling reminder that mercy was not a part of their language. The first human soldiers set foot on the alien soil, their boots thudding against the earth like an ominous drumbeat. Every step they took was deliberate, their presence commanding the air around them. They moved quickly, methodically, setting up perimeters, securing key areas. It was clear that they were not here to negotiate. They were here to take over. The alien survivors, still trying to comprehend what had just happened, huddled in fear. How could this be happening? They had called for help, for a chance to survive, and this was the answer they had received. The humans didn't care for their history, their culture, their cry for mercy. They only cared about power. The Deathworlders didn't offer peace, they offered domination. The alien leaders watched in silence as the humans moved through their planet, erecting fortifications and setting up communication lines. The survivors were given no choice but to submit to their rule. Resistance was met with harsh punishment, and the invaders showed no interest in anything other than total control. The alien race, once powerful and proud, was now left at the mercy of the Deathworlders. Some of the survivors tried to fight back, desperate to protect what little they had left. But their weapons were useless against the overwhelming might of the humans. The Deathworlders' ships loomed above, casting shadows that seemed to swallow the light. The alien race was helpless, trapped under the iron fist of their so-called saviors. The leaders of the alien survivors met in secret, their faces grim as they discussed their fate. "We asked for help," one of them whispered, his voice shaking. "But we were given only destruction. The Deathworlders are not here to save us. They are here to claim us, to break us. We have no hope." But even as fear crept into their hearts, some of the survivors refused to accept their fate. "We may not have the power they do," one rebel leader said, standing tall despite the weight of their situation, "but we will not go quietly. We may not win, but we will fight. We will make them know that we will not be erased." The rest of the survivors nodded, a flicker of hope lighting up their eyes. The humans may have arrived with fleets and firepower, but they did not know what it meant to face a race that would never give up, no matter how hopeless the odds seemed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about dignity, about fighting for their people, their planet, their future. But even as the alien leaders began to plot their next move, the truth weighed heavily on them. The Deathworlders had not come to heal or help. They had come to conquer. The question was not whether they could defeat the invaders, but whether they could ever live under their rule. The alien survivors could only wait, their eyes turned to the dark sky above, watching the fleet as it continued its silent watch. The fate of their world had already been decided. The Deathworlders had come, and they would not leave until they had taken everything. But as long as the aliens still breathed, the fight was far from over. And somewhere, deep inside, the survivors knew that they could never give up. Even if the storm was already here, they would rise again. The presence of the Deathworlder fleet loomed over the alien planet like a nightmare made real. The once clear skies were now veiled by the towering warships that filled the atmosphere, casting shadows over the devastated landscape below. The ships were massive, more enormous than anything the aliens had ever seen, their sharp edges cutting through the air, their engines humming with a power that sent shivers through the bones of those who dared to look up. To the alien survivors, this was no rescue. It was the arrival of something far darker, something that carried not the promise of salvation, but the harsh reality of subjugation. The ships didn't descend with the intention of peace. They came to enforce control, to wipe out any remnants of hope that might have still existed within the hearts of the survivors. The Deathworlders had answered the plea, but not with the help the aliens had imagined. Instead, they had come with firepower, weapons, and a will that would reshape the planet. The survivors, hiding in the ruins of their once thriving cities, watched in silence as the ships began to descend. They had hoped, even for a fleeting moment, that help would come in the form of mercy, perhaps a force to heal and rebuild. But the sight before them was nothing like they had expected. It was a reminder that there was no kindness to be found in the heart of the Deathworlders, only the cold, calculated power of a species that knew nothing but dominance. The first wave of human soldiers, clad in their dark, metallic armor, began to disembark from the ships. Their faces were hidden behind helmets, but their movements spoke volumes. They moved with purpose, with precision, like a machine. There was no hesitation in their steps, no sign of doubt. They were here to claim this world, and nothing would stand in their way. The alien survivors, weak and broken, were no match for the might of the Deathworlders. The soldiers spread out, quickly taking control of key locations, securing vital areas with their overwhelming strength and military precision. The survivors could only watch, helpless, as the humans established their presence, sweeping through the cities with ruthless efficiency. The death toll continued to rise, not because of battle, but because of the relentless pursuit of control. The survivors knew that resistance was futile. The Deathworlders had come not to fight for freedom, but to eliminate it entirely. Inside the rebel camps, hidden deep within the wreckage, the leaders of the alien survivors began to plan again. They had hoped that their cries for help would bring something other than an invasion, but the truth was now clear. The Deathworlders had come to show the alien race their place in the galaxy, beneath the boot of humanity. The survivors knew that fighting back would not be easy. The Deathworlders were far too powerful. But as they looked around at the remnants of their people, a new fire began to burn in their hearts. They would not be crushed without a fight. If this was the world they had to die on, they would make sure that their last act would not be one of submission. The leader of the alien resistance, a young warrior with a fierce determination in her eyes, stood before the gathered survivors. They came with their warships, their soldiers, and their weapons. But they do not know what we are capable of. We have lost everything, but we still have one thing left, our will to survive. We will not go quietly. We will fight for this planet, for our people, and for our future. Her words echoed in the silent air, filling the survivors with a sense of purpose that had been missing since the first wave of the invasion. Despite the overwhelming odds, they would not bend to the will of the Deathworlders. They had one chance left, and they would take it. The survivors, though beaten and scattered, began to unite. Small groups of rebels started to gather in secret, devising plans to strike back at the heart of the Deathworlders' control. They knew they couldn't win in a head-on confrontation, but they had the element of surprise on their side. They would strike when the humans least expected it, using their knowledge of the land, the terrain, and the human weaknesses. The Deathworlders may have superior technology, but they had failed to understand the determination of the alien race they had sought to wipe out. As the Deathworlders continued their march across the alien cities, establishing their control, the survivors began their counterattacks. Small, tactical strikes, aimed at weakening the human presence, began to make an impact. The aliens sabotaged supply lines, disrupted communications, and caused chaos in the human ranks. The Deathworlders, though powerful, were not invincible. The rebels knew they could not defeat the humans outright, but they could make their occupation uncomfortable. They could show them that no one was going to roll over without a fight. The Deathworlders, frustrated by the resistance, began to increase their presence. More soldiers, more weapons, more ships. They believed the rebellion would be crushed quickly, but the aliens had underestimated the resolve of the survivors. They had made a mistake by assuming that the alien race would simply give up. The rebels had no intention of giving up. They would fight as long as they could, knowing that the Deathworlders' grip on the planet was not as unshakable as it seemed. As the survivors regrouped and planned their next move, they felt the weight of the war growing heavier. The Deathworlders were not just conquerors. They were an empire built on power, and they would stop at nothing to subjugate this world. The aliens knew that their fight had only just begun. The Deathworlders had shown their true face, and now the real war was starting. The tension in the air was palpable as the alien survivors, battered but determined, watched from their hidden camps. The Deathworlders' presence had not wavered, their ships still casting their dark shadows across the planet. Every move the humans made was precise, calculated, and relentless. Their soldiers patrolled the streets, their weapons drawn, their eyes never leaving the prisoners they had subdued. The alien survivors knew their world had changed forever, but one thing had become clear: this was not the end. This was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The alien leader, though weary from the constant strain of watching their world be reshaped by the Deathworlders, stood before his people, his voice steady despite the crushing weight of defeat. "We've seen what they are capable of," he said, his eyes scanning the gathered survivors. "But they have underestimated us. We may be broken, but we are not done. They think they have us. They think we will submit. But we will not. Not while we still breathe." The survivors, their faces gaunt and hollow from the hardship, gathered around him, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They had been brought to the edge of extinction, forced to watch their homes burn and their families suffer, but they had not given up. They had fought back when there was no hope left, and they would do so again. They were not ready to fall to the Deathworlders' might without a struggle. "We can't face them directly," the leader continued, his gaze hardening, "but we can fight from the shadows. We know their weaknesses. We know their patterns. And we have something they don't, our will to survive." His words were quiet but fierce. There was no more time to grieve, no more time to question their fate. They had to act, and they had to do it now. As night fell, the rebellion began in earnest. The survivors moved like phantoms, slipping through the darkened streets, their small but well-coordinated strikes making a real impact. The Deathworlders, with all their firepower, were not accustomed to such resistance. The aliens sabotaged their supply lines, disabled their communications, and began to disrupt the human forces in ways they had not expected. It wasn't much, but it was a message. They were still here. They were still fighting. But the Deathworlders' response was swift. The humans, frustrated by the alien resistance, unleashed their full might. The streets lit up with the sound of gunfire, the crackle of explosions, and the flash of energy weapons. The survivors scrambled, retreating into the safety of their hideouts, but the humans were relentless. They hunted down any signs of rebellion, showing no mercy. Those who fought back were either captured or executed without hesitation. The Deathworlders had no time for weakness or compassion. The alien survivors, though, had learned something valuable. The Deathworlders were powerful, yes, but they were not invincible. They could be stretched thin. The rebellion's guerrilla tactics, though small, were starting to weaken the humans' hold. Every supply depot destroyed, every communication network disrupted, was a small victory. The aliens were not facing an army. They were facing an empire, one that could be beaten, slowly but surely. The leader of the rebellion gathered his people again, the fire of determination still burning in his eyes. "We've struck a blow. We've shown them that we won't be crushed. But this fight is far from over. They will come for us with everything they have. We need to be ready. We need to make sure they never forget who we are. We are not their slaves. We are not their victims." And so, the rebellion grew, fueled by the fire of those who had lost everything, but refused to lose hope. The survivors knew that the Deathworlders' empire would not fall easily, but they also knew that they would not go quietly into the night. Every day, every moment, the resistance grew stronger. Their attacks became more sophisticated, more effective. They began to hit the Deathworlders where it hurt the most, at the heart of their operations. And as the humans' resources began to dwindle, the rebels knew that the tide of war was beginning to shift. But the Deathworlders were not fools. They could feel the resistance growing, and they would not allow it to spread. The next move was theirs to make. The survivors had provoked them, and the humans would not sit idly by. The full might of the Deathworlder fleet would soon be brought to bear, and the alien survivors would find themselves fighting not just for survival, but for their very existence. The storm was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The fight had taken a darker turn. The alien survivors, now fully aware of the magnitude of their situation, had pushed back in ways they had never imagined they could. They had learned to use the shadows, to fight from within their own ruined cities, and slowly, they had chipped away at the Deathworlders' seemingly impenetrable strength. But as their small victories piled up, so did the retaliation. The Deathworlders, though powerful and unstoppable, were not prepared for the tenacity of the alien survivors. Their patience was running thin, and now, the Deathworlders would strike back with everything they had. The human forces, already overwhelmed by the persistent attacks, called in reinforcements from across the galaxy. The aliens had made a mistake. They had thought their resistance could remain unnoticed, but the Deathworlders had now turned their focus entirely on them. The fleet above the planet grew larger, more ships and soldiers arriving, ready to crush whatever rebellion still existed. And the survivors could feel it. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It had become a fight for dominance. The rebel leader gathered the remaining survivors, her face etched with worry, but her voice strong. "We've shown them that we won't break," she said, standing tall in front of the group. "But they're bringing everything they have now. They think we'll fold under pressure. We cannot give in. This is the final stand for our world. This is the moment where we prove to them that we are more than just the last remnants of a dying race. We are fighters. We are survivors." The survivors, though battered and weary, nodded in agreement. They had fought tooth and nail, through every defeat and every loss, and now, the humans would make their move. The rebellion had pushed the Deathworlders to their limits, but now, they would face a full-scale assault that would leave nothing behind. The survivors knew that the next few hours, the next few days, would determine the future of their planet. As the human fleet descended, the skies darkened once more. Their warships, so large they blotted out the stars, filled the atmosphere. The ground rumbled as their ships' engines roared with unimaginable power. The invaders had arrived, and this time, they were not just interested in defeating the alien forces. They were interested in wiping out the rebellion, ensuring that this world would belong to them, forever. The survivors had no illusions. If they lost this battle, there would be no second chances. Their world would be forever altered, and their people would be erased. The resistance made one last, desperate plan. Knowing that they couldn't stand up to the full might of the human fleet in an open confrontation, they would target the humans' weaknesses once more. They gathered every last bit of strength they had, organizing a final assault on the central hub of the Deathworlders' operations. They would disable their communications, disrupt their power supply, and cripple their infrastructure. It was a suicide mission, one that would likely cost them everything, but it was their only chance to give their world a chance to survive. As they began their mission, the first explosions echoed in the distance, lighting up the sky with bursts of orange and red. The alien survivors moved with all the stealth and precision they had learned over the weeks of struggle. Every strike was calculated, every move intentional. But the human soldiers were everywhere, their movements just as fast and methodical. The battle was chaotic, with gunfire and explosions shaking the ground beneath them. The survivors pushed forward, knowing that the cost of failure was unthinkable. The leader of the rebellion, blooded and tired, fought beside them, her eyes filled with fierce determination. They had come so far, had made so many sacrifices. She wouldn't let it all end like this. She couldn't. The battle raged on as the human forces seemed to pour out from every corner of the city. The survivors knew they couldn't hold out for long. Too many soldiers, too many weapons, and too much firepower. But they fought back with everything they had, using the knowledge of their world, their environment, and their desperation as weapons of their own. And then, as the last line of defense fell, and the survivors made their final push toward the heart of the human operation, the leader's mind flashed to the message they had sent so many weeks ago. The hope, the prayer that someone would come. What had seemed like an answer from the stars had turned into their greatest nightmare. But even in this final moment, when all seemed lost, she didn't regret the call. If they had to be crushed by the Deathworlders, at least they would go down fighting. They would show the universe that even the smallest species, no matter how hopeless their cause, could stand against overwhelming force. But the battle wasn't over yet. The Deathworlders had underestimated them. The humans might have had the firepower, but the aliens still had their will to survive, and it would not be extinguished easily. The leader gritted her teeth and continued the fight, knowing that this was their world, their home, and no matter what happened, they would die defending it. The survivors pushed through the enemy lines, taking out vital equipment and creating more chaos in the human ranks. They had made their point. The Deathworlders were not going to have an easy victory. But as the human forces began to regain control, and the surviving rebels prepared for the inevitable, the leader knew one thing. No matter what came next, the Deathworlders would never forget this world, this fight, and the alien race that had dared to defy them. The dust had barely settled from the chaos of the final assault when the full weight of their actions began to sink in. The survivors, bruised and blooded, stood in the shadows of what remained of their cities, watching as the Deathworlders regrouped and tightened their hold. The rebellion, though successful in some small ways, had not broken the back of the Deathworlder Empire. The humans had been forced to withdraw temporarily, but it was clear they would return with even greater force. The survivors knew that this was not a battle that could be won with a single strike. Their planet had become a battleground, and the Deathworlders would not rest until they had completely taken control. The survivors had pushed the humans to the edge, but the tide was about to turn. It was only a matter of time before the humans regrouped, stronger than before, and wiped out every last vestige of resistance. The rebel leader, her eyes heavy with the burden of leadership, stood at the front of a new gathering. Their world, once a thriving place filled with culture and life, was now a graveyard, scarred by the war they had waged. She could feel the weight of their losses, the sacrifices that had been made. But in the eyes of the survivors, there was something else, something more than fear. It was resolve. They had not given up, and they wouldn't. Not now. We are not done yet, the leader said, her voice steady, though the fatigue in her eyes was evident. We may have lost this battle, but the war is still ours to fight. The Deathworlders may have firepower, they may have armies, but they do not have what we have. They do not have our will. And we will use that will to make them pay for every inch of this world they take. The survivors, though exhausted, nodded in silent agreement. The leader's words had not only reinvigorated their spirits but reminded them of what they had left to fight for. They had lost their cities, their families, and their homes, but they still had their lives, and they still had each other. The coming days were filled with endless planning. The survivors knew that the next human offensive would be coming soon, and they would need to be ready. They spent their time learning from their previous mistakes, strengthening their positions, and preparing for the inevitable conflict. They had learned that striking in small, precise ways had been effective, but now they needed something more. The elder, who had always been the voice of reason, spoke to the leaders of the rebellion, offering the same quiet wisdom that had guided them through the darkest times. We will not face the Deathworlders in open combat, he said. We must be smarter. We will not be defeated by their weapons. We will be defeated by their arrogance. They think they have conquered us, but we will show them that we are not conquered yet. The rebel leaders nodded, taking in the elder's words. They were learning. The Deathworlders might have superior technology and military power, but the alien survivors had something just as powerful: their resilience and their will to never surrender. They had to exploit the weaknesses the humans had shown and create a battle plan that would surprise their enemies. As the days passed, the survivors began their preparations. They fortified their remaining strongholds, creating traps and defenses to slow the Deathworlders' progress. The Deathworlders had left many of their forces spread thin, and it was time to exploit that. The aliens began to sabotage key human infrastructure, slowly eroding the Deathworlders' resources. While the humans grew confident, believing they had crushed most of the rebellion, the survivors worked in silence. They knew that a small spark could ignite a much larger fire, and that spark was coming. Soon, their small victories began to add up. The Deathworlders, though powerful, were not infallible. Their pride and overconfidence made them vulnerable. The rebel leader had learned that their greatest weapon was their ability to strike where the humans least expected it. They did not need to defeat the entire fleet, but they could disrupt it. They could make the Deathworlders question their strength. They could make them fear that even a small resistance could bring their whole operation down. As the alien survivors prepared to strike again, they knew the next confrontation would be their most important yet. The Deathworlders had learned to fear them, and the rebellion had learned to fear nothing. The stage was set for a battle that would change the fate of their world. Though the war had taken everything from them, the aliens were not ready to give up. The Deathworlders had not yet realized that the resistance was stronger than ever. The survivors would fight until their last breath, not just to survive, but to prove that they would never be erased. The storm had come, but the aliens would stand tall against it, because they were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their legacy. The pressure was mounting, but so was the resolve of the alien survivors. Every day that passed, every secret attack, every sabotage operation, brought them closer to the final showdown. They had learned how to strike quickly, disappear into the shadows, and regroup before the Deathworlders could retaliate. It was a game of cat and mouse, one that had cost them dearly, but it had also taught them the value of patience. But they knew the inevitable was coming. The Deathworlders were regrouping, their forces replenished, their supply lines restocked. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that the resistance was not a mere nuisance, it was a growing threat. The alien survivors understood the risk they were about to take, but the price of inaction was far too high. The Deathworlders were too powerful, too determined to let this planet stand in defiance. The time for small-scale resistance was over. The alien leaders held a secret meeting, their faces grim but determined. The rebellion had reached a tipping point. No longer could they hide in the shadows. They would have to face the Deathworlders head-on. The plan was simple: hit the core of the Deathworlders' operations and cripple their power once and for all. They would need everything: their remaining weapons, their stealth, their courage, and, most of all, unity. The rebel leader stood before them, the weight of their decision heavy on her shoulders. "This is our last chance," she said. "If we fail, it's over. The Deathworlders will erase us from this planet. But if we succeed, we can break their hold. We can turn the tide of this war." There was silence in the room as each survivor understood the gravity of the situation. There would be no more hiding, no more small strikes. This would be their final stand. The rebels were ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for the chance to save their people. They prepared for the assault, knowing the risk was greater than anything they had ever attempted. The Deathworlders were not going to stand idly by. The fleet above the planet was more than just a group of warships. It was a fortress. The core of their operation, hidden within the largest ship, was where the central command was located. If they could infiltrate that ship and disable its core systems, they could cripple the entire Deathworld fleet. The alien survivors knew they had only one chance. The Deathworlders' fleet was vast and heavily guarded, but they had something the humans didn't: the knowledge of their world. They knew the terrain, the hidden passageways, the abandoned ruins that could be used for cover. They would move like shadows, striking when the Deathworlders least expected it. But time was running out. As the night grew darker, the survivors moved into position, ready to launch their final assault. The sounds of the warships above were constant now, a reminder of how much was at stake. The rebel leader, along with her most trusted soldiers, crept through the back alleys of their city, avoiding detection. The tension was unbearable. Every step they took was one step closer to the heart of the Deathworlder operation, and every moment they spent moving closer brought the reality of their mission into sharper focus. The final assault began with a series of well-coordinated explosions that rattled the Deathworlders' outer defenses. The survivors moved quickly, knowing that the clock was ticking. The humans would surely retaliate, and if they couldn't disable the core in time, their efforts would be in vain. The rebel leader's heart raced as she led the charge, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside the Deathworlder base, chaos erupted. The humans, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance, scrambled to regain control. The alien survivors used their knowledge of the facility to their advantage, taking out key soldiers, disrupting communication lines, and disabling the security systems. The final push was coming, and they had no time to waste. As they approached the central command room, the leader of the rebellion looked back at her team. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We take this room, and we take back our planet." They nodded, their faces steeled with resolve. They breached the command room, and in the heart of the base, they planted the explosives that would disable the Deathworlders' central operations. The countdown began. With only minutes to spare, the rebel leader and her team made their escape, knowing that if they failed, the Deathworlders would reclaim everything they had fought for. The escape was frantic, but they managed to get out just in time. The explosive detonated, sending shockwaves through the base, knocking the Deathworlders' control systems offline. The fleet above faltered. The tide of the war had shifted. As the survivors made their way to safety, they could hear the distant sounds of the Deathworlders trying to regain control, but it was too late. The damage was done. The rebellion had struck the heart of the Deathworlders' power, and for the first time, they had slowed the storm. The alien leader looked out over the chaos below, her heart pounding with adrenaline and hope. The Deathworlders would not leave. They would retaliate. But for the first time since the invasion began, the survivors felt a glimmer of hope. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The fight for their planet was now in their hands. As the Deathworlders regrouped and began their search for the rebels, the alien survivors knew one thing. No matter the outcome, they would continue to fight. The storm had come, but they had not been broken. The Deathworlders had underestimated them, and now the aliens would make sure the humans knew they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The resilience of a race fighting for their survival. The echoes of the explosion still reverberated through the city as the survivors regrouped. The plan had worked, but the cost had been high. The Deathworlder fleet was in disarray, but the humans weren't finished yet. They would retaliate, that much was certain. The survivors knew this victory was just a temporary reprieve, a small flicker of hope in an otherwise darkened world. The Deathworlders were coming back with even more force, and the aliens would have to be ready. But for now, they had a moment, a brief, fleeting moment of relief. The rebel leader looked over her people, seeing the exhaustion and determination in their eyes. The battle they had just fought had taken everything from them, yet they still stood. The fight was far from over, but today, they had won something important. This victory is ours, but the Deathworlders will return. They will try to wipe us out completely, the rebel leader said, her voice steady, though her heart was heavy with the knowledge of the fight ahead. But we've shown them that we will not be easily defeated. We will continue to fight, and we will take back what is ours, piece by piece. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, though there was an underlying fear in the air. They had seen the full might of the Deathworlders, their firepower, their technology, and the sheer size of their fleet. How could a small, broken resistance hope to stand against that? But in the survivors' eyes, something had changed. They had seen that it wasn't just power that determined victory. It was will, courage, and the desire to protect what mattered most. The survivors gathered in small groups, assessing the damage, salvaging what they could, and preparing for the next phase. They knew the Deathworlders would send reinforcements. The massive warships, still hovering above, were a constant reminder that their battle was far from over. The humans had not forgotten them. But the survivors also knew that the Deathworlders were not invincible. They had made mistakes. They had underestimated the aliens' resolve. While the Deathworlders regrouped, the survivors continued their work. They had already begun to devise their next strategy, learning from the previous battle. The rebellion had grown stronger with each attack, and the survivors were beginning to develop new tactics to strike back more effectively. They would not let the Deathworlders' superior firepower be the end of them. The alien leader, though weary, held a quiet meeting with the remaining commanders. We must disrupt them even more. We've seen that they are not invincible. They may have overwhelming numbers, but we have the element of surprise, and we have the strength of our people behind us. We will strike again. The question is when, and how. The other commanders nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. But the alternative, surrender, submission, was worse than death. They had to keep fighting. For their people. For their planet. In the background, scouts returned with information. The Deathworlders were consolidating their forces, preparing for another wave of attacks. But the survivors had already begun to prepare, too. They knew the human forces wouldn't be caught off guard again, so they had to act quickly. As the rebellion's forces moved to strike again, they faced a different kind of battle now. The humans were learning from their mistakes, but the aliens had learned even faster. The next phase of the conflict would test their strength, their adaptability, and their resilience in ways they hadn't experienced before. The Deathworlders would come with overwhelming force, but the alien survivors now knew they were capable of more than they had thought possible. The countdown had begun. The Deathworlders would come, and the aliens would be ready. They had proven that even against impossible odds, they could make their enemies bleed. Now, they would take the fight to the Deathworlders once again. Every second counted, and they were no longer hiding. The time for resistance was now. And so, the alien survivors, once on the brink of extinction, stood once again, united in their purpose. The Deathworlders may have brought their fleets, their firepower, and their overwhelming strength. But the aliens had something the humans could never take away. Their spirit, their will to survive, and the knowledge that they were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting for their future, for their planet, and for the right to exist. The final battle was drawing nearer, and the aliens knew one thing above all else. They would not go down without a fight. The storm had come, but the Deathworlders would soon learn that even the fiercest storm could be weathered by those who refused to give in. The night before the next wave of conflict, the alien survivors gathered once more in the heart of their hidden encampment, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of small campfires. The war, which had already cost them so much, was now entering its most critical phase. The Deathworlders were not backing down. The warships overhead continued to cast their long shadows across the planet. The hum of their engines a constant reminder that the next step of the fight would be even more brutal than before. The alien leader stood in front of his people, his gaze steady, but the weight of their losses hung heavy on his shoulders. "Tomorrow, we will face them again," he began, his voice low but firm. "The Deathworlders believe that they can crush us. They think that we are broken, that our fight is over. But we are not finished. As long as we have breath in our bodies, we will continue to resist. We will not be wiped from the face of this planet." The survivors around him nodded, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and determination. They had been pushed to their limits, each victory coming at the cost of great sacrifice. But they were still standing. They were still fighting. And that made them stronger than the Deathworlders could ever understand. "We've learned from our past battles," the leader continued. "We know how they think, how they move. This time, we won't just react. We'll strike first, and we'll do it in ways they can't predict. It's time to show them that this fight will cost them more than they thought." The rebel leaders gathered closer, discussing plans in hushed voices. The humans were predictable in some ways, arrogant, perhaps, in thinking that their overwhelming power alone would be enough to break the alien spirit. But what the Deathworlders didn't understand was that this small, oppressed alien race had more fight in them than they could ever anticipate. The survivors had a strength that wasn't rooted in weaponry or technology. It was a strength born of necessity, of survival, and of an unbreakable will to protect their home. As the survivors prepared for the final stage of their counterattack, they moved with purpose. Every action was deliberate, every step calculated. They had learned to use the terrain to their advantage, moving through the ruins of their cities with swift precision. They had no choice but to act now. The Deathworlders' resources were vast, and their patience thin. The aliens could only hope that the element of surprise would give them the upper hand. In the dead of night, the first phase of their plan began. Small groups of rebels set out to sabotage human infrastructure, communications, supply lines, anything that could weaken the Deathworlders' grip on the planet. It wasn't just about destroying the humans' resources, it was about sending a message. The alien race wasn't dead yet. They would never be dead while they still had the will to fight. The explosions echoed through the night, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The survivors knew they had to move quickly. Every minute they wasted would be another minute the Deathworlders used to strengthen their position. The aliens had learned to be shadows, to strike and disappear, and now was no different. But as they moved deeper into the heart of the Deathworlders' territory, they realized something had changed. The humans were ready. It was a trap. The survivors had underestimated the humans' ability to adapt. The humans had not just responded with force, they had responded with intelligence. They had anticipated this move, knowing that the aliens would try to strike in the same way they had before. The Deathworlders had prepared, and now they were forcing the survivors into a confrontation they were not ready for. The sound of human soldiers closing in on them sent a ripple of fear through the rebels. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and trapped. But even as the Deathworlders advanced, the alien leader refused to let his people break. Stay focused. We've come too far to fall now. Fight as if this is the last battle, because it may very well be. But remember, they are not invincible. We can still win this. The rebel leader's words sparked something in the hearts of the survivors. They had been cornered before, and they had fought their way out. This was no different. The rebels began to fight back, using every last bit of energy they had left. The humans, though stronger, had not anticipated the sheer desperation that fueled the alien resistance. The battle was fierce, brutal, and unforgiving, but it was not over. The human forces fought back hard, but the aliens, though overwhelmed, pushed forward. The streets were filled with gunfire and explosions as both sides clashed. The survivors knew they couldn't hold out for long, but they fought with the knowledge that if they lost this battle, their planet would fall into complete subjugation. There could be no surrender. As the hours passed, the battle raged on, and slowly, the tide began to shift. The Deathworlders, stretched thin and fatigued from their earlier battles, were beginning to buckle. The aliens had learned how to strike their enemies where it hurt most, and their tenacity was beginning to show. The human soldiers, who had once felt invincible, were now starting to feel the pressure. They had underestimated the resolve of their opponents. The survivors knew they couldn't win this fight alone. But as the Deathworlders' ranks thinned, the survivors realized something else. They were not alone. The rebellion had grown. Their fight had sparked something in other corners of the galaxy, in other oppressed races who had once looked on in fear. And now, they too were rising to join the cause. The tide of the war had begun to shift. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the freedom of their people, their world, and for a future that the Deathworlders could never take. But there was still much to be done. The Deathworlders had only been pushed back, not defeated. The fight was far from over. The survivors knew the war would continue, but they also knew one thing above all else. They had taken the first step toward reclaiming their world, and no matter how long it took, they would never stop fighting. The hours that followed the battle were a blur of chaos and exhaustion. The alien survivors, bloodied and broken, retreated into the safety of their hidden strongholds. The Deathworlders had regrouped quickly, their might once again looming overhead, but for the first time since the invasion began, the aliens held something that the humans could not take from them. A victory, no matter how small. The rebel leader stood atop the ruins of a once thriving city, her eyes scanning the devastation around her. The fires that burned in the distance were a constant reminder of the cost of this war. But they had struck a blow, and that blow was not forgotten. She could feel the weight of her people's hope on her shoulders. "We've shown them we're not finished," she said quietly to her closest officers. "But this is just the beginning. They won't give up. And neither will we." The survivors were tired, some more than others, but they had not lost hope. The Deathworlders had underestimated them. They thought they could crush them with overwhelming force, but the aliens had fought back. The road ahead was dark, but they had proven that they could stand against the might of one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. 4 days, the survivors regrouped, tending to their wounded, gathering what little they could from the wreckage. The Deathworlders had imposed their rule, but they had also left gaps. Their forces, though massive, were not invulnerable. The aliens knew how to exploit those weaknesses, and they began to organize once again, each survivor offering what they could for the next phase of the war. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The humans would come back with a vengeance, and this time, they would be more prepared, more ruthless. But the rebellion had grown stronger. The survivors were no longer just resisting. They were learning to fight in ways that the Deathworlders hadn't expected. The alien leader addressed her people, her voice carrying through the silent crowd. "We've been knocked down, but we have not been defeated. The Deathworlders will not stop until they've taken everything from us, but we will not let that happen. We will stand and fight for every inch of our land, every person who is still alive, and for every future that still has a chance." The survivors, their faces worn with the fatigue of endless fighting, stood tall in her presence. They had seen their cities fall, their families torn apart, and their homes burned to the ground. Yet, they had not given up. They had fought when it seemed hopeless, and now they were ready to fight again. Across the ruined world, other pockets of resistance began to stir. The battle, it seemed, had sparked something across the galaxy. The alien race had shown the universe that they would not go quietly into the night. They had made the Deathworlders bleed, and now others, who had once feared the Deathworlders' wrath, began to rise in defiance. The fight for this world was far from over, but the alien survivors had ignited a fire that would spread. They knew, however, that the battle to reclaim their world would not be won quickly. The Deathworlders had vast resources, and their fleets had not left. They would regroup, adapt, and prepare for their next assault. But the alien survivors had something the Deathworlders lacked: the knowledge of their planet, the spirit to survive, and the will to never surrender. They would continue to fight, not for victory, but for the chance to remain free. As the survivors prepared for the next stage of the war, they didn't just face an enemy. They faced the ultimate test of their will and their humanity. And as long as one of them remained standing, they would never stop fighting to protect the planet they had once called home. The storm had come, but they would weather it together, no matter the cost. The Deathworlders would learn that no matter how powerful they were, there was something far stronger: the unyielding will of a people who refused to be erased.